Hey everyone, I'm recording this for us on the afternoon of Thursday, March the 26th, 2020, at just a little bit after 3 p.m. And I'm still learning how to make this thing run, so I hope it won't be too confusing. Um, we're looking at the first 15 slides from the PowerPoint presentation titled 1909-12 Five-Factor Model of Personality. Um, so here's our first slide. And the sort of subheading is that there's more than one way to skin the personality cat, and the five-factor model is not the only one. And that just means that we could spend an entire semester or more talking about all the different approaches that psychologists and mental health professionals have developed to describe and explain the differences between us. And we're going to focus on the five-factor model because it's current, it has a lot of research behind it. I think it has a lot to offer us. Um, Before we actually start talking about the five-factor model, it's useful to sort of bring us up to speed real quick on psychological measurement and what's the logic behind psychological measurement. So in a given population, whether this is humans or non-human animals, um, we expect to see variation between individuals in terms of how reactive they are to the environment and how they solve problems. And when we are talking about how reactive they are to the environment, think back to when we were talking about behaviorism and how the behaviorist said all of our behaviors are determined by previous reward or punishment from the environment, where reinforcement or reward makes the probability that a behavior goes up, and punishment makes the probability um, that a behavior is repeated go down. And so a big way of how to think about the five-factor model is how are we different in terms of our sensitivities to reward and punishment, um, but also how we solve problems. One of the things about psychology that the other mental health and mental health approaches, medicine, social work, etc., is that really psychology owns measurement and testing. This is the one thing that licensed practitioners can do, that is, administer, interpret tests that medical doctors can't do or social workers can't do. Now, one of the reasons that I chose the five-factor model test is that you don't have to have a license to administer and interpret it. That's a little bit more specialized. Now, in terms of the kinds of things that psychologists have, I used the word constructs earlier, the types of categories of individual differences that psychologists have developed tests and measures for. The two major legacy constructs are intelligence and personality. And the measurement of intelligence, especially, goes back to the beginning of the 20th century and extends a little bit further back. And measurement of personality is not quite as old, but it's close. Excuse me. Taking a second for me to figure out how to use the draw tool and also switch between slides. So, of those two legacy constructs, intelligence and personality, um, intelligence is broadly a construct about how easily and quickly an individual, compared to the entire group, learns new things and applies them in a problem-solving way. Um, as I mentioned, to actually administer, score, and interpret an official, you can take it to court intelligence test, you have to be trained and you have to be licensed. And if you know anything about uh, the if you know anything about the sort of conflicts and arguments about just exactly what intelligence is, you know that a lot of people have suggested that this is a variable, that this is a construct that maybe doesn't have a lot of usefulness. Um, and I think that the measurement, the attempt to try to measure intelligence and compare amongst people how quickly and easily an individual compared to the entire group learns new things and applies them in problem solving ways. It's been an important thing to attempt to measure. I think that a lot of times intelligence scores have been given too much weight in various kinds of situations. And indeed, while I think it's true that differences in intelligence scores can give you some prediction about how successful a person is going to be in life, they're not the they're not necessarily the most important or the most accurate in kinds of things that we can measure about people that will determine how successful they are over time. So before we get to talking about personality, I wanted to mention that there's a related concept to intelligence called aptitude. And aptitude, measures of aptitude, are really supposed to be about what you have actually learned to do and what you know you can learn more about. So, what are the skills and abilities that you have? Maybe you have a natural talent for them, or maybe you've just worked really hard, but what do you actually know how to do? So, one of the things that's sort of interesting about the history of the development of the measurements of intelligence is that going back to the beginning of the 21st, pardon me, going back to the beginning of the 20th century, the two major driving constituencies, the two major consumers for intelligence tests were the educational system and the armed forces. And specifically in the United States, this goes back to the beginning of World War I, where the United States had really sort of had a conflict internally about whether to enter that war or whether to remain neutral. And when the United States committed to deciding to enter the war that was mostly being fought in Europe, we had to do two things really fast. One was we had to build a navy, and the second was we had to really increase the number of men at arms, both in the Army and the Navy, which included the Marines. And the Army wanted a quick paper and pencil test to identify people who would be most likely to succeed in command positions versus people who needed to do more enlisted work. So at the beginning of the 20th century, that was the main push for the development of written intelligence tests. And as I mentioned, as the 20th century progressed, weaknesses as well as strengths of the idea of of whether or not intelligence is the most important, just raw intelligence is the most important thing to measure. Whether intelligence was the most important thing to measure sort of moved on, and eventually the armed forces moved on to preferring measurements of this thing called aptitude, the things that you can do. And so always there are some students who have taken the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, which is shortened to ASVAB. And the ASVAB just wanted to jump over to the Wikipedia page for the ASVAB. The ASVAB is a set of tests that all of the armed services have invested a great deal of effort into developing. And always there are a few students in the intro psych classes who've taken the ASVAB, and there's usually two ways that people take it. One, either they've talked to a military recruiter and have investigated whether or not they're going, whether or not they want to go into one of the service branches, or it's something that their high school offers. So if you haven't taken it and you want to take it, then you probably should talk with a recruiter, and they'll probably want to sign you up. And you don't have to sign up, even though they'll want to. They'll want you to. So, here's just some things that the ASVAB, it's like I said, there's a computerized part, there's a written part. And so it shows like, here's things that are in the computerized part: your general science knowledge, your ability to do math, your word knowledge, paragraph comprehension, math knowledge, electronics, automotive, mechanical, assembling objects, verbal expression. Then we measure the same things here in a written format. And if you enter the armed services, then your score on the ASVAB pretty much really determines what kinds of positions you can train for. So they put a lot of work into this, and it's got a lot of reliability and validity, the two things that we're going to be talking about that we want psychological measurements to have. So now getting back to the five-factor model, the other big construct, the first two being intelligence, the second one being aptitude, which kind of developed out of the measurement of intelligence but is more particular and less general. The other one that psychologists have been trying to measure for a long time is personality. And broadly, when we're talking about personality, we're trying to describe how an individual reacts to and interacts with the environment in a way that is relatively unique and consistent through time and across situations to him or her. So that's what this five-factor model that I asked you to take was all about. Okay. If we were talking about different kind of models of personality, we could talk about them as being empirically based from the start, that is based on observed measurements, or theoretically based. It's like there's some ways of discussing and measuring personality, And the Freudian approach is a good example. Dr. Freud listened to the information that his clients, his patients gave him when they laid on his couch and did their free association, and he watched his kids grow up and he thought about himself. And he came up with a theory of how personality works from a psychological perspective based on those observations. And then after that, people applied the theory. The five-factor model is based strictly on empirical information from the beginning. If we want to be really particular about it, the reason that I use the term five-factor model and not five-factor theory is because technically the five-factor model isn't actual theory because it doesn't offer explanations for where the five factors originate. Now, for some of the factors, a couple of them especially, I think we have some well-developed theories about where they come from, and we'll talk more about those in the next presentation. But even though the five-factor model does not offer explanations for where the five factors originate, where they come from, the measurements themselves are a reasonably good and useful way of thinking about individual differences in people and in non-human animals. So one of the things that's a strength of the five-factor model is that we have done enough research to understand what it is that the scores predict in terms of our tendencies to behave. Okay, so even though the five-factor model is not a theory in and of itself, there is a theory that guided the development of the five-factor model. And that is lexical theory. Lexical theory is the idea that the variety of words that exist in languages to describe differences between people reflect actual individual differences that exist between individuals. So if you go back and remember B.F. Skinner saying our internal descriptions of why we're doing what we're doing are epiphenomena. They're accidental byproducts of our behavior. Lexical theory is giving us more credit. Lexical theory is that the idea that these adjectives, all the different adjectives that people have come up with to explain differences, describe differences between people's behaviors, have meaning value. They give us actual information. There is in the quiz bank, like, what does lexical mean? Lexical means having to do with words. For instance, a lexicon is a list of specialized words. A dictionary is a lexicon. And as a matter of fact, when people started developing the five-factor theory, the very first thing that they did was go to a dictionary and start sorting all the words that were adjectives for describing differences between people. Now, we've talked about experiments and we've talked about correlational studies. And now when we're talking about this kind of psychological measurement, we're getting into, we could possibly get into some statistics that are really way above our pay grade for this class. I will just tell you that the particular statistical method that led to sorting adjectives into the 5 factors that you got on your interpretive reports is a method that, okay, we asked people how much on a scale of 1 to 5 does this word or term accurately describe someone else you know. And then we also ask people on that same scale of 1 to 5, how much do these words describe yourself? And you'll recall that for the version that you took, you answered 120 questions. You answered 120 questions. So we look at the correlation between everybody's description on question 1 and the correlation with question 2. And then we looked at the correlation between question 1 and question 3. Then the correlation between question 1 and question 4, all the way down to number 120. Then we go back to number 2, and we look at the correlation between 2 and 3 and 2 and 4 and 2 and 5 down to 120. Then we go to question 3 and go through the rest of the list, and we do this hundreds of times. And we have statistical processes that give us rules for how to group. How do these adjectives group together? And when we're talking factor analysis talk, we talk about the main factors emerging. Main factors emerging. And so if you remember in your report, you got main scores on 5 big factors: extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness to experience. And then under each of those main factors, it gave you another set of scores for what they called facets. And basically what they did is, after they said, okay, out of the 120 questions that we asked, there are out of the 120 questions that we asked, 24 of those questions refer to neuroticism, 24 of those refer to extroversion, 24 to openness, 24 to agreeableness, 24 to conscientiousness. And then they take those smaller pools and factor analyzed just those words. Just those words to derive the facets. Now, the way it ought to work, and it's pretty interesting to look at people's individual scores and their facet scores. One of the things we're going to be talking about in the next recording is what are some of the, how do you interpret some of the high and low facet scores? The way it ought to work is that facet scores for any given person should be more correlated with each other than with facets in the other main factors. And not only should they be correlated to the other facet scores in that factor, they should be highly correlated to the overall factor score. That doesn't always work out as cleanly as you kind of would expect, but for the most part, it does. Okay, so if we don't have a theory that explains why there are 5 factors within the 5-factor model, we had the theory about why we ought to probably be able to find something like the 5-factor model, which we did. And that theory was there are going to be general classes of adjectives that describe actual differences in terms of our tendencies to behave and react. So a couple of times when we were doing the first unit, I said, to me, I think that if we ever come up with another big overall theory of everything psychologically, it's going to be something like functionalism, which framed things in terms of the question, how does this behavior enhance the individual's survival and success? And it becomes pretty informative to apply functional explanations as to why the 5 big groups of words exist. They give information about how easy we are or are not to get along with, and how we prioritize our attention, and what kinds of behaviors some of us are more likely to engage in than others. One of the things that is true, or it becomes evidence that it's true when you start to think about it, is that if everybody had the same reaction to the environment all the time, then we'd all want exactly the same thing all the time. And we'd all be competing for the same thing at the same time. And this probably wouldn't work out very well. Okay, so we just talked about the overall logic behind the 5-factor theory. And earlier I mentioned that if we're doing a psychological measurement of anything, whether it's intelligence, whether it's aptitude, whether it's personality in general, whether we're testing for people's acquisition of knowledge in a class, we want our measurement to have 2 main characteristics. We want it to be reliable, and we want it to be valid. So the term reliability refers to the quality of the measurement. That is, how good is the measurement? Are results for individuals consistent across time? If you think about, if we're gonna say that personality, the idea of personality, is a meaningful thing to measure and talk about, part of the assumption, and the same goes true for intelligence or aptitude, that if your test is good, then it ought to show the same level of differences between people across time, to the extent that we stay consistent across time. And actually, I think humans do stay consistent across time a lot of the time. The other thing is validity. And validity is about the meaning of the measurement. Do your scores reliably predict behavioral and experiential differences amongst people, especially when scores are most extreme? And we'll be talking about that in just a minute. It's like one of the reasons that why did I ask you to take the 5-factor test as opposed to other kinds of online personality quizzes or assessments? And part of the reason is that there is a big body of research work behind the 5-factor model. This isn't like something that you look on Facebook and it's ask like rank your 3 favorite colors, and then it tells you what kind of person you are, or any of those kind of silly quizzes that might have 10 questions or so. The reason that the 5-factor model is useful and is that we have done enough research to begin to understand what specific kinds of reactions and behaviors the scores predict. And again, this is, we'll be talking soon about why more extreme scores are more predictive than less extreme scores. One important thing to keep in mind about psychological measurement, anytime we take sort of a psychological test, but this is actually true in anything we try to measure, is that our measurement is never perfect. There's always error.